as you know, the GrOW program, what we do, of course, is generate evidence and with that try to impact policy in low-income countries on women's economic empowerment. As we set out, we do that through three thematic areas. One is labor markets. One of the sessions yesterday, or one of the sessions today, will be on that aspect. We always said we would do more on, we would work on entrepreneurship, and I think the program does less on that than we initially designed. But that was one of the thematic areas originally, and of course the care economy. We had a lot of discussion on that already, and we look at those three thematic areas through three sets of questions, and I thought it might be most useful to provide some highlights through those three sets of questions. The three sets of questions, we look at the impact of empowerment on growth, we look at the impact of growth on empowerment, and it's probably most of the empirical research is on the constraints to empowerment. On the first question, on the impact of women's economic empowerment on growth, I think Karen Ground's presentation gave us a lot of grounding, if you like, of how the literature on this has evolved, and I think she very much emphasized that although there's a lot of evidence generated over the last 2 decades, one of the things she stressed was that the care economy is still not sufficiently reflected in that literature. So I think that our emphasis on the care economy, if you look at her presentation, clearly fills a gap there. I think the two main presentations that we heard about yesterday in that area was one, Stephan Klasen, who's focused on the systematic, is doing a systematic review that looks specifically at whether closing the education gaps contributes to economic growth, and I think his initial results, emphasis on initial, very much confirms that yes, overall in that particular area there is most of the good studies tell us that link is indeed there. And I think Marcela's presentation, no results yet, but is looking at similarly whether particular women's interventions for women's economic empowerment has a broader impact, perhaps more human development, very much in that same area. I think this is the win-win question, if you like, us promoting empowerment, promote growth. The second set of questions is around the impact of growth on women's economic empowerment, and I think we had probably about 4 papers that at this moment speak to that. Again, Stephan Klasen looked at the impact of growth on segregation, occupational and sectoral segregation in the labor markets, and I think for me that was a common theme. Is like we're not seeing very clear impacts on growth on any of those dimensions of empowerment. And I think very importantly, I don't think we spend a lot of time on that, but the paper he and his team are doing on violence similarly shows that there are not, I don't know if I remember this correctly, but there are not very clear links between growth and reduction of violence. Janneke presented in that same area on the impact of trade, particularly import tariffs, and I think very importantly what you see there is that again there's not a straightforward impact, but it very much depends on the structure of the economy, and then the paper from the Urban Institute team, Liz and Nan, presented looking at the DHS, and I thought I had not seen that before. I thought the way you used some of the DHS categorization of aspects of women's economic empowerment was quite interesting. We will have a discussion on measurement, of course, but I thought those different aspects and how you showed that it really depends on what you're looking at, which measure you take really is directly relevant for whether you can see an impact of growth on any of the aspects of empowerment. I think the issue of measurement comes out very clearly there, and obviously we're going to discuss that in the next session. So these were the two main kind of macro linkage questions. The The third area of GrOW then looks at the constraints to women's economic empowerment. Like I said, probably overall this has, you know, most of the empirical research identifies these constraints. Of course, there was a whole set of there's a set of papers around the care economy. Look at those. The systematic review, I think, is producing some very interesting and quite clear, heterogeneous but clear results. I think, and I think both both our RCTs in India and Kenya are very much in that line that try to identify what the impact of provision of childcare is on women's labor force participation. And then, of course, the 4-country study led by IDRC Sussex is a more descriptive study looking at how care is incorporated into government policies. So then, so far, and most of today will be I think, in that same area, same trend is the examples of how the constraint to women's economic empowerment are addressed. The 2 examples that we did see, one was, of course, the cash transfers in Tanzania. That interesting. It looks at, if you have a program, and I think this is an important thing we need to bring back to discuss it. Here's a program that is not specifically targeted at women's economic empowerment, and which are probably most of the programs that we know of and that are relevant, and looking at whether those do or don't help, and what design, in the end, how those can be changed in terms of the design that can promote women's economic empowerment. And finally, of course, not finally in sequence, but in that series, the research that looks at what institutions promote women's political participation in Africa. So today you'll see many more of those examples, particularly in that area of how women's economic constraints are being addressed. But we'll start with a session on mention.
Morning. While the ladies set up front, I just wanted to give you a quick housekeeping kind of reminder, which is tomorrow, which seems like very far away for you, but we're having a few kind of clinics. One is on data visualization. There was an email sent, and I'm happy to send you a reminder today for all of you interested in learning about Tableau and Picture Chart. It really go a long way if you can download the program sometime today, just so we can kind of run the session smoothly tomorrow. It's a free kind of program, and we send you all the instructions. I'll make sure to do that again, but just take some time if you're interested in joining to do that. The other 2 sessions are in parallel, so you get to choose which one you go to. There's one led by Claire Wells, raise your hand, on policy briefs, and there's one on academic writing, which is going to be led by Madiha. So they have the option of attending either one. My strong suggestion, since most teams have 2 people, is to kind of spread so you can kind of share the learning across teams later on, and that's happening. And then a last reminder is open space sessions, and I'm going to put this outside in the coffee area for you to sign up. There's already some proposals, but if you have any others, page 2. If you are not joining any of the sessions I just described and want to have kind of conversations with teams about any other subject, that's kind of the time and space in the agenda to do so. All right. So, today's panel is focused on measurements of women's economic empowerment. As Ariane said, we had a lot of kind of speakers comment on the challenges of what and how we measure. So, today's panel, we have 3 volunteers from the GrOW program, Rachel and Shahana, who are working on Bangladesh, as you will hear more about today, and then Carolyn, who you heard from yesterday, talking on childcare in the Nairobi slums. We wanted to bring kind of another regional perspective, so we asked Susana Martinez Restrepo to come and give us some of her experience on what works and doesn't work in measurements, given some work that she's done in Colombia and Peru, and she's going to kind of guide us through that discussion and facilitate the session, and then hear from our colleagues of what it is that they're doing in their projects, and have a larger discussion with you on what we know kind of works better, what works, what doesn't, to have a holistic picture of women's empowerment.
Is there any way to turn off this? You hear me? We had problems with the sound yesterday. I think it didn't maybe this one? Yeah, can you see better? Okay, hi everybody, and thank you for the invitation. I wanted to give a little bit of a background of how this idea came through. I got a grant from the IDRC 3 years ago that I think changed my life. It was the first time that I worked really with gender and vulnerable women in Colombia, rural Colombia, displaced women by violence. Before that, women were observations in my STARA program. So as a result of these data gathering that we did, it was mixed methods. We had a RCT impact evaluation of a program called Red Unidos, which is aimed at eradicating extreme poverty. And we had the quantitative part and the qualitative part, and I decided to go in the qualitative part. I was getting divorced, so that's important because I didn't want to be home, and I went to like a month in rural areas, and I learned so much, so it was amazing. And as a result, I started seeing that also researchers sometimes don't go to the field, and I went also only because I had a personal experience. But I started seeing a lot of problems with the measurements that we were using to measure women's empowerment, and being very critical of it. I tried to experiment, and something really interesting about working with the IDRC is that they let us experiment. So what happened is that, for example, we realized that the instrument measuring decision making was having some problems. We were getting some information from the quantitative, and in the qualitative that I went to almost every focus group, we heard that people were saying different things. And then also when we tried to pilot some of the new fashion of how to measure subjective measures of well-being, the stairs of well-being and autonomy and other measurements, I took some questions from the questionnaires of OFI, Sabina Alquire, that looked really amazing. But when we went to implement these with women at extreme poverty, women were not really understanding the questions, these objective questions. So we started to think how we could improve these, sometimes even in the field, between the pilot and the real implementation. And I wrote my paper, and actually 2 papers about it. And all these things that I am telling you, not about the divorce, but the rest, were a footnote. So I told to Carolina, Carolina is my grant manager and IDRC, this is really interesting, and I think that a lot of researchers working in developing countries need to know this. So let's write something and let's get together. So we got together 3 researchers. Alma Espino from Uruguay is one of my co-authors, and Johanna Giancari from the Instituto de Estudios Peruanos from Peru is another one of my co-authors. And we started planning these, and actually the IDRC liked it so much that we said, let's get involved GrOW and Asia and Africa, and let's say this for other places. So what's going on? So this panel, we opened the applications for these grants to include Asia and Africa very recently, so we couldn't have the grantees in this panel, but we decided to hear not only, I will tell you what I learned from the Colombian experience and also from my co-authors are finding in Uruguay and in Peru, but we wanted to have here other researchers that have similar, not exactly, but similar evidence from Bangladesh and from Kenya. It doesn't have to be necessarily being critical of everything, but also how qualitative methods can inform quantitative methods. How can we improve those methodologies and maybe quantify it? I'm an economist, so I want to quantify everything. So we can all have different perspectives, but the idea of this panel is to think and to show what methodologies for us have worked, what hasn't worked, and at the end, this is the first round of questions, and at the end, make some suggestions. I don't have either the responses about what should we do exactly to improve. If you have some ideas, it's great, because we're starting to write a book. But it's more like a debate on being a little bit critical, and particularly, I'm not saying that these instruments don't work, is that in the case of Colombia, Peru, and Uruguay, when we go to rural areas, to women that only have second degree primary school, it's really hard for them to understand some of these instruments. So for these specific cases, it is important to think about it, and also to think that Latin America is different from what is going on maybe in Asia and Africa. So just a little background from Colombia. In Colombia, there's currently 9%, 4.4% of the population are under extreme poverty. And 8%, actually, this is more now, 8% or 10% of the population is displaced by violence. It's, I think, the third country in the world with the highest number of displaced people. How do I go next? Okay, so I already told you this. So something that we decided not to go into the literature because I think that we are all very familiar, and I already took a lot of time talking about my divorce. But what we want to do is not to understand that the literature is very often measuring how we measure empowerment with decision-making instruments, how we measure empowerment with proxies of economic labor participation, whether they're informal, entrepreneurship, so on and so forth. And recently, we have been thinking more about subjective measures of well-being, because also this is a process, like Ubanyopo said yesterday. This is not only, we have a lot of proxies, and we want to measure something in one point of time, but this is also a process, and there is a lot of subjective involved on it. So I want to, my first case, and I have several cases, is to talk about decision-making surveys, and I heard a lot of people with results about this yesterday, so I'm a little bit critical about decision-making surveys because of what we found in Peru and in Colombia. So as you know, we think that if women have the power to decide over some items in the household, that they're going to be empowered. So that sounds really good. Something that happened in Colombia and in Peru, let me show you the questions. These were very similar. So first, this is in Spanish, I'm sorry, but it says, when you take decisions about about whether to work or not, inside or outside the household, who takes the decision? So me, my husband, me and my husband, or me with someone else, other family members. So as you see, these are just descriptives. We were piloting these among 95 women. Most women said that the decision was taken by them. And this was very interesting because when we went to the focus groups, we found something completely different. And they were saying, no, my husband doesn't let me work, I cannot go outside because he's jealous, he doesn't let me. I'm like, why are they responding that they are taking the decisions, but when we really have the opportunity to talk to them, they're telling us this is not true. As a result, I created a behavioral experiment that is really cool, and I'm going to show you, but after that, to really understand how the decision of working or not was taken among the couple. So this was the first thing that I think it didn't work. This is very common. We divided this question about when you take decision at home with regards to bigger purchases like a fridge, like a washer machine, or like furniture, who takes the decision? And this is very important because in Latin America, the first set of questions with small purchases like groceries and so on and so forth is very common that is done by women. I'm going to go back to this. So this you can see that is mainly taken by women or by women and their partners. But again, when we talk to them in the qualitative focus groups, it was completely different. Like, no, I can decide over my children's stuff, but I cannot decide whether to buy a fridge or something. I have to ask for permission, or he just comes with it. And in Peru, it was very interesting because what they considered was making a decision in the instrument. When they asked it in the focus group, they considered that if men came and told them, oh, by the way, I'm gonna buy a fridge, they consider that as a joint decision. So in Peru it was similar than in Colombia. So basically, as a result, from the first case, no, let me go back a second, something that I forgot. Small purchases. In Colombia, and this is very important for the comparison between among other regions, small purchases like whether you buy the uniform for the children, or you take your children to whether they go to school or not. These are decisions that are historically made by women. There's a book by Fulper called Super Mothers, and it is like this role of the mother in Latin America is so important that no matter what, nobody's gonna mess on that part of being a super mother, and nobody's gonna take ever away your children from you. It's like a very strong role that is very well defended. So those small purchases that we often consider in the case of Latin America as empowerment are not necessarily empowerment, are something that are already their role, and actually empowerment could be more that men do something because they have so much work. On average, rural women in Colombia spend 10 hours on the care of the children and household duties. So Ugonio also said something about that yesterday. Is there really more empowerment to make all decisions, or that is taking away their time to be economically empowered? So that's, well, as a result of the first case that I told you, that women were saying that they were taking the decision about work or not, I didn't believe them. How long I have? Okay, so I'm gonna do two more, this and another. So the behavioral experiment, we said, okay, we don't believe them because there's this contradiction in methods, and we created an experiment. I'm not going to go in details, but basically the treatment was to make a decision. We made a job offer. It's a lab experiment. It has many problems, like Marcela said yesterday, but we wanted to know what were the decisions. And we put a control group and a treatment group, and the treatment group was making the decision with the husband, and the control group was making a decision by themselves. And we found a difference, a strong difference. I'm not going to complicate with the table. This is the money that we're offering. So we found a strong difference, particularly the women were less likely to take a job when the husbands were there, but the difference was larger if it was an informal job. They prefer flexibility. So this just tells us that it matters. They are saying, when in surveys they are asked, they are saying that they take the decision. In the qualitative, they're saying that husbands don't let them, and when we do behavioral experiments, we see that not in every case, but there's an influence. They are making maybe joint decisions. In some cases, the men were telling them what to do. Having children would influence the decision. Accepting an informal job would influence the decision. So this is just to think about how we analyze the results and whether we are believing. I'll show you later. No, I don't have time, but I have the paper. I can send it to you. And yeah, just the third case to finish and to go on with the third. Subjective well-being. I really like what Ofi at Oxford, Sabina Alkida, is doing to try to land what Amartya Sen was saying about capability deprivation and freedom and agency. And they developed these really cool instruments, and I said, let's pilot. And they have the stairs of well-being, which is very widely used. So it was good that it was a pilot because it didn't work. And I didn't spend a lot of it. Was 95 women. So these were the dimensions about self-esteem and empowerment. I want to concentrate on the stairs of well-being because I don't have time. So I guess that you all know the stairs of well-being and autonomy. Imagine a stairs with 10 stairs where when you are in the first stair, are people that don't have freedom to choose over their lives, and on the highest, the 10th, are people that have more freedom to choose over their lives. Where are you now? Where were you? Where are your neighbors? And where were you 5 years ago? So in the case of Peru, they used this question, and in Peru, it took on average 8 minutes to respond each question. And my co-author is like me, not because of the words, but she goes to field work and she hears what people are saying, and she's like, we cannot use this. It took so long to explain that they're going to respond what the interviewer is trying for them to respond, so they just canceled. I didn't use it either. In my case, it was just so funny. I remember one case that this woman, just to explain the difficulty to understand subjective measures. Where were you 5 years ago in terms of the stairs, freedom to choose? I used to live with my mother-in-law. Let's see, where are you now? Now I live with my husband. And I was like, okay, she didn't understand this. And it could be that before she was worse off and today she's better off. But in any case, my approach was like, she's not really understanding this question and many more. So I think that this doesn't work. I'm going to tell at the end on the second round which will be the proposals, but this is an example. My conclusion with this, just to finish, is that there was a very complex, this requires a very complex process of thinking that maybe us can understand, because we are thinking about abstract concepts, but for example, if you read the book Scarcity, that helped me a lot to understand these, when you have a very low education background and you're used to surviving the day-to-day, you need concrete objects, concepts based on your local reality of daily survival. So this is one of the explanations that I give why this was one of the questions, but then it didn't work out. So this is the case of Colombia and Peru, and yeah, this is the case of Colombia and Peru, and now we want to go and see what is going on in Bangladesh and in Kenya. We just came together yesterday, so we don't expect to have exactly the same information, but it's just to see whether they are having, basically the question that now I do is what has worked, what hasn't worked in your research, in quantitative and qualitative, and then in the second one we'll go to discuss what we could do.
So just on that last point on abstract concepts, I remember my incredible frustration in doing an agriculture survey in Sierra Leone and realizing that farmers could not answer the question, was your harvest bigger this year than last? Like, you would think that the harvest of a farmer was extremely important to them, and I thought that that would be easier than asking how big was your harvest last year, how big was your harvest this year. They're completely and utterly incapable of doing that comparison because it's just too abstract. They just didn't understand what I was asking. So again, shows the importance of doing lots of piloting before you do anything. So in our, and when you say people on their second level of primary education, that's really educated in a lot of the communities I'm working with. So in our work in Bangladesh, we were asked to just say, what did we mean by empowerment? So I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are the different focus areas, and each part of this will have many questions. But I did want to draw your attention to the fact that within each area, we ask, what do you know about that field? Do you negotiate about that? And what's the final outcome? So, for example, on marriage, do you know the health problems of marrying early? Did you negotiate about your marriage? Were you involved in the decision making about the marriage at all? And then the outcome would be, were they married as a child or not? So the equivalent for all these different areas. And so we're asking this negotiation and decision making in many different areas. So I just want to focus on what worked and what didn't. So here's an example of what didn't work. Mobility is an extremely important aspect of women's empowerment in Bangladesh. Can women go where they want to? Is it a barrier to them accessing healthcare? Is it a barrier to accessing education or income generation? I had this very, clear model in my mind that of how mobility worked. Some unempowered women would only be able to go a certain distance on their own, and so the barriers, they're cluster of households in Bangladesh, and then you have the village, and then you have other villages around it. So in my kind of naive sense, we're asking questions that try to say, for example, maybe a woman could go to other houses within the Bari on her own, but would have to go with a relative if it was somewhere else within the village. Well, what turned out to be is that we were then working, our target group was then adolescent girls, and they might well be able to go to school on their own, which was in another village, but they couldn't go to a fair even in the same village. So it mattered what it was for, as well as who you went with. But you might be well able to go on your own to school because that was an approved activity, but going to a fair was something. What I mean by a fair is, people come with, selling things. It might be it's a temporary activity, and when the fair comes to town, people want to go and buy things, but that's for the girl's own benefit. It's not going to benefit the rest of the family at all, and it's seen as something more frivolous, and therefore she's not allowed to go. And I think this is really what we're talking about when we're talking about empowerment, is being able to do things that you want to do for yourself, right? So this really made us change how we asked it, and we didn't ask about mobility in general, but we have to ask about mobility on very specific tasks and aspects. So now we have a whole long list of questions about, in the last month, did you go to, a whole bunch of things, from school and college to, to the market, to other things, and then who accompanies you. And I think the bit that I'm most happy with is about visiting parent. Now our girls are married, and so we're asking about visiting parents. Are they allowed to go visit their parents? And did they, because this is something that is controlled in their life. We assume that they want to go visit their mother, but it's often very restricted. So this is something that everyone would want to do, and their ability to go, I think, is an important measure of their control. But you have to ask it about a specific thing. So what worked was being specific. And here I also had a lot of concerns about the general decision-making question. So as well as asking the standard decision-making question about who makes decisions about health, we ask about a specific health question that every woman with a child will have come across, and what do they do then? Because in my experience, you just get much better answers when you're talking about something very specific. So we say, if your child is sick and needs immediate health care, but your husband is not home, what do? Do you take the child to the doctor right away? Do you wait for your husband to return? Do you go with your in-laws? Do you talk to your husband before you can go? Do you take help from relatives, neighbors? And obviously you don't, if you don't have children, that's not relevant. Again, if you need medicine for yourself, if you have a headache, can you go and get headache medicine? Like, this just seems something that happens to everybody all the time. And if you can't go, out of your house and into the village to get headache medicine, it seems like that's a really important barrier to you achieving what you need. And again, it's very deliberately, it's a question that's only going to benefit the mother herself, because that, I think, is the essence of empowerment. Now, what's quite interesting, so we're, as you'll hear later, we're only a third of the way through collecting our end-line data. So, any data I'm going to show you is going to be very preliminary. but I had my research assistant last night, after the conversations we've had, run an analysis of whether we get different answers when we ask the standard decision-making question and whether we ask these questions. And she was up till 1 in the morning trying to get these numbers right. So I'm just restricting it to married girls with children, married women with children. We keep calling them girls because they were girls at the beginning of the process. I've gone through and changed it to women everywhere, but who usually makes decisions about healthcare? So that's kind of the standard DHS question, and you get 13% say women, a lot of people say spouse. We actually get fewer of these joint things than you were complaining everyone said joint. And I have seen that elsewhere in our India data set on microfinance. Everyone just said it was joint. And I was like, what does that mean? But then if you ask, it actually goes up if you ask this specific question. So more women are able to take the action themselves, and that's partly probably because we're asking about a small thing, and they may think the health care is a big thing. But again, that just shows the vagueness of the question. What do you mean by healthcare? Do you mean, taking them, when they have a fever, or if they're in a big accident, or if there's, they have cancer? I mean, these are just really, really different decisions. So who knows what people have in their mind when we ask that standard DHS question. So it goes up. Women on their own, 58% can immediately act when their child is sick. There's still a lot of women who have to go via their spouse, even for like that immediate, need. And who usually purchases medicine, and can the girl buy medicine herself if she needs it? That actually goes up to 60%. But then that's, half glass full, like that's 40% of women who just can't even buy an aspirin if they've got a headache. So I think, why I was talking about before about can you understand and sort of visualize and think through, what do these questions that we're asking mean? I think you have a very clear view of what this question is about. Like everyone can visualize what this means, and interpreting it is much easier. So this is just an internal consistency. So we've taken one woman and seen how she answers that same question, and we see quite a lot of inconsistencies. So let me see if I can get this right. So who usually makes decisions about healthcare? The percent who report they can make healthcare decisions alone or jointly with the spouse. That's the first column. Then we say who can make the decision if the child is sick. So then we say of the 12% who say that they make healthcare decisions, only 23%, when you ask the specific question, say that they can make it on their own. So, so we're just getting, these are all of that 23%, 50% usually purchase. And this is, can the girl buy medicine? Can the girl buy medicine herself? The percent of girls who report no of those who said they make healthcare decisions. So this is, she can't even buy an aspirin. So 30% of people can't buy an aspirin who said, who report that they make health decisions. Not sure that's quite right. This is, can the girl buy medicine herself? The percent of girls who report no of those who said they make healthcare decisions. So this is 30% of this number. No, it's healthcare decisions. So it's this one. So this is the percent of these, of this. So it's a little bit confusing, I agree. And I mean, we were just running this last night, but the basic point is to say that there were a lot of people who are, so in the previous table we saw people who said no, they couldn't make a health decision, but they actually could, when it was a very specific, small decision. But we also get it the other way around, which is people who are saying they can make decisions about healthcare, but even in these small decisions, they end up saying no. So that just really raises a lot of questions in my mind about exactly what we're getting out of this general decision-making question. I mean, it does correlate with other things, so that's a good thing about it, but as I say, I much prefer these specific decisions. So I'm just gonna, the other thing that I think works, and this is, I've done more of this in other contexts than in this, but getting non-survey measures. So one of the things that we see increases with our intervention that I'm going to talk about next is, you know, these girls are very malnourished. They sort of have 30% stunting rates in this community, and we take anthropometric measures, and their weight goes up, which in this context is a good thing, right? In this environment is a good thing. So you know, that just makes me feel like anything else that you might worry about how they're answering the question. If their weight is higher, that's really concrete evidence that something very positive is going on. The other thing we're going to do, we haven't done in this round, but we're applying to NIH to do in future rounds as we follow these women, is to take hair samples and test them for cortisol, and that is a measure of stress. Because, you know, we've a lot of the literature talks about the importance of the main cause of stress being not having control over your environment. And my co-author Erica Field has measured cortisol levels in young mothers in India, and they are just off the charts. I mean, these women are so stressed. And so to have a very concrete measure of stress that you can, you know, that's sort of a biomedical marker, nobody's going to argue about how they're answering the question like these women are stressed. In Sierra Leone, I've done a lot of non-survey measures when looking at whether community-driven development improves empowerment. The one I like best is because we had the same thing about the decision-making. So this is sort of decision-making over communal activities, and about sort of village resources. And again, we had this experience when we were piloting, we were asking, were you part of the decision? And this man was saying, yes, yes, absolutely, I was part of the decision. And we're like, we were there when the decision was being made. You weren't there, you were in your house. He said, yes, but my chief had input, and I know my chief does what I want. So I was involved in the decision, and we're like, no, that's not what we meant at all. So we were literally, when we were piloting, you know, we would run an experiment, we would offer the village a choice. Most of the time, the chief just made the choice without asking anyone. And then we would go around and interview people, and a lot of people would say they were part of the decision when we knew that they weren't, right? So what we did is, in the survey, we said we'd like to give a thank you gift to the community for participating in the survey. We have two choices, salt or batteries. Which would you like? Let's call a community meeting. Called a community meeting and then observed the discussion and whether women spoke in that discussion. So it was a real choice the village had to make, and we saw who spoke and how many women speak, and that's one of our main measures of participation, is how many women spoke at that meeting. And I think you can get, you know, again, if you just rely on self-report, you know, what does being part of the decision mean? But if you see how many women that, in this case, we found no more women spoke, and therefore we concluded there hadn't been an increase in empowerment of participation of women in decision making.
Can you hear me? I'll talk about some of the qualitative things, since you were hearing about all this about the quantitative part of it. In Bangladesh, when Rachel expressed the same project we were working, so we worked with the adolescent girls for that project, and when we are doing the inline evaluation, we had one qualitative part of it. Actually, when we tried to think about the measuring the indicators in the qualitative part, we are actually struggled a lot. So we went through a number of pre-testing. What would be the areas which we can use for talking to the girls? So after the rigorous pre-testing, we found that we can talk about their education, talk about their life goals, their marriage, all of the process, the economic activities they are involved in, the savings they are doing, the mobility, the decision making, which is also a controversial issue. It's both for married and unmarried girls, and participation in the programs, either in development or other programs. All these work, but there are some points which didn't work. So one is the relationship with their husbands, is particularly for the married girls, and joint decision making, which we are, I think we are hearing from yesterday. So what if we talk about it, I think the most important thing is the context where the girls are living, whether they are living in rural area, what are the constraints they are going through, and the other thing, whether they are women or girls. Like if you think about the adolescent girls who are 10 to 19, when they are becoming a little aged, like when they cross 14 and 15 and becoming married, by the virtue of their age and by the virtue of living in a context which is different from when they are unmarried and they are being married and having all the responsibilities of a family and the other members, they actually gain some of the experience which can be expressed, whatever we asked, expressed in a maybe in the empowerment indices. And the other thing is the context, and they are brought up. The context, I'm meaning that whenever they're putting into a context where they have to show something deliberately, then I think they gain some of it. And also their ages, when they are becoming a little old, by years and years, they also gain some of them. So all these things we also have considered when we ask the questions to the girls. So rather than asking a direct question to them, we actually started with a story, like what happened when they were children and how they are growing up, how they are being educated, how their marriage happened, what were the process, and what were the economic, if they are involved in, what were the economic activities, how they are becoming involved with that process, and how they are becoming successful. And the other question was, did they have any kind of savings in their hand, and how they learn it, and what are the outcomes of that, how they are using it. And then mobility questions, already Rachel mentioned about it. We also talked about the mobility regarding their education, regarding going to the friend's house or going to the market, and you already heard that there are some restrictions. Even though they can go to the school, but they can go to the market, even they need need to buy some of the education materials. They can go to the friend's house without their parents or in-laws' approval. So these are the things we also have to consider. The other thing is the decision making, which is tricky part of it. Whenever they are going to some friend's house, it's not their decision that can work. They have to take the approval. But those who are successful, they actually used some of the strategies which we are going to present afterwards, by which they are becoming successful to go to that part. So I think these are the things we need to think about it. And the two things didn't work when we did the pre-testing and we started the qualitative work. Actually, when we went through the qualitative work, first when we started, we have to change many things when we started, even though we have a lot of pre-testing. So one thing didn't work, it is the relationship with the husband. Because when he asked this one, everyone is telling that it's very good. Because, I mean, if you ask something in our context, someone is telling negative thing, it's beyond the ritual. You know, so they are thinking that something, asking by themselves, we have to say yes, whatever it is, even they are beaten. You can't say no or nothing. So everything is positive. So when we got the same answer from all the girls, even though we know that something is being happened at the ground, so we changed this one. Like we have broken down everything with some of the, you know, thing like when we thought about the relationship, what is coming in our mind? One is like whether the husbands are behaving friendly with their wives. The next one is whether they are caring during the illness of their wives, whether they are sharing their emotions or plans with their wives. Whatever plan, it may be a business plan, it may be a plan regarding education or making assets, and whether they are encouraging their wives to do something positive, whether they are appreciating their wives to do something good, whether they are helping their wives in the household work or whether it's needed if she is overburdened, whether they are chatting or doing shopping or going to the cinema or going somewhere, you know, visiting friends or something with their wives, whether they are allowing their wives to go to the market or going to the cinema or somewhere else to be, you know, to be entertained. Whether there are some husbands who are residing outside their country, whether they are calling their wives frequently or not. But the last question was really tricky because sometimes it is the controlling over the wives. Those husbands are calling again and again, maybe after 1 hour, you know, calling in, where are you? What are you eating? What are you doing? Where are you going? Where is my children? And this is, I mean, I see that this is a kind of controlling over their wives sometimes. So you have to know the tones of those questions if you want to know whether they are controlling or whether they are caring. So these kind of questions we asked to understand the relation with the husbands, and then we found that it's not actually those girls who are actually telling them that the relationship is really good. It's not like that. They were meant to say yes in those contexts where we are asking the questions. And the other thing was sometimes if you are asking this question in parents' house and if you are asking the questions in their in-laws' house, that will make a difference. So I think measurement is also a question which context we are living in. The next one is joint decision making we are hearing about, and it's same thing happened. Like everyone is telling, yes, we did it jointly. Very boldly they are telling that we did it jointly. But when you probe it, like think about the contraception. We are talking about delaying, you know, childbirth. So we are talking about contraception, and after probing sometimes, they are telling that their husbands actually buying all these pills for them and giving it to them to take those. So it's already been imposed, but they are telling that it's joined. Why it's joined to them? Because it's buying by their husband and taking by their wives. So it means joined to them. So I think we need to understand what's being practiced at the ground level, and then we have to, you know, the measure, or we have to rank, or we have to understand what they are doing. We also have taken care of, you know, whether, you know, during the childbirth, whether the joint decision has been made, like where the child is going to be delivered, whether it is in hospital or at home. So it's again the same thing. But the good thing is sometimes there are in-laws and there are few friends and relatives who are also influencing the decision. It's not only the husband. So sometimes if they are really positive, some positive influence is going to be made, so we will get. So we didn't ask the direct questions to them, rather we want to understand the whole story about it. And from there we want to get what is the real answer of that one. And the other one is the gender-based violence and gender attitude. We also found the same thing. like whether if something is wrong during cooking, whether they have to be beaten by their husbands. They're telling, yes, I did the wrong thing, why shouldn't he beat me? It's very normal. And then we are asking that it was not normal to have something, bad during cooking. It may happen for anyone. It can be burned, it can be, it can be put some spices more. So, I mean, if it is not intentional, is it going to be normal? And then they understand the questions, and then they are telling no. But the thing is, the custom in that context, if they say no, that is real bad for them. So we understand the custom, so we know that even though they, in their mind, they understand it's wrong to say no, but they are telling to us. So sometimes we have to understand the whole context of it and the custom, and then we can think about the women's economic empowerment, the measurement indicators. Thank you.
Thank you. And since many of you had already heard about our project, I won't give you a background as to what we're doing. But then I'll begin with some reflections that I've been having just sitting here. And when you're in the field as a researcher and you're working in a community, especially like ours, where you've been running a demographic and health surveillance for over 12 years, and you're going to households every 3 or 4 months, ask people a list of questions. It's a real respondent bias. And yes, it's great to capture every single nuance in the meaning of different things, but in the end you have to make a balance. And I know, at least from working in Nairobi, that you really have to think about the length of the questionnaire and how much detail you can go to with every single question, because you end up with, I've seen questionnaires that run up to 97 pages, and one question I always ask, is it fair? Would you do it if you were the one who was the respondent? So I'm just putting that out there because, yes, in a way, it's also talking about maybe we're the ones who are doing all the wrong things based on what everyone else has said. But I think it's a real balance because, yes, you want to capture some of the nuances, but can you get measures that will, that you can sort of validate using correlations and things like that. So in terms of our project, we're really looking at several dimensions. Voice and influence of household decisions, and of course, using similar questions to the DHS. And I think the caveat that I was giving at the beginning is based on that. Can we get some measures that will at least capture everything, because we cannot have a nuanced assessment and keep the questionnaire short. Access to resources, and then self-assessment of well-being, and then I just put choice there because from the mix, from the participatory approach that we took, then you're able to listen to women's voices and they talk about choice. If I had a choice, I would do this. Let's just say that. Problem with this hair. So in terms of access to resources, we asked women, did you engage in any activity, including self-employment, that generated income in cash or kind in the last month? And as I mentioned yesterday, 61% of women were involved in income-generating activities. But a third of them were earning less than $25. And I can tell you, Nairobi is an expensive city, and that is a huge constraint if you're earning that much. You have access to any personal savings. So yes, although many of these women were working, only 20% or 1 in 5 reported some form of personal savings. So in other words, many of them are, it's living hand to mouth in terms of you have money, you have very little that you can save. We also asked, you have a bank account, M-Pesa. M-Pesa is a mobile transfer service offered by the largest cell phone service provider. And M-Shwari is also, it's a savings account as well, but works on the M-Pesa platform. But you can actually save money and you can access loans through it. And if yes, you have a shared account, or is it your own? And here we lumped M-Pesa, M-Shwari bank account. We did not disaggregate. We did not ask them separately, do you have a bank account, do you have M-Pesa, do you have M-Shwari? It was a single question. And this is what it was. So 79% said they had their own, either bank account, M-Pesa or M-Shwari. And then 2% were shared or joint. And I suspect many of those are people who are joint accounts, not the M-Pesa. And 1 in 5 were not using it at all. We use the standard DHS question. When your household usually makes decisions about spending income, family finances, home purchases, health of the children, schooling of children older than 6, and then regarding the care of children 5 years and younger. And this is what the data look like, that majority of the women are either involved alone or jointly. And of course, there's some differences based on whether they're spending their own income, which is the first bar, versus the health of the children and the care of children and the 5. So women are the ones making those decisions primarily. But then we see some differences. If you then look at whether a woman is working versus she's not working, and we see that, of course, women who are working, the bar on my left, facing that way, if a woman is working, then really she's the one making that decision. She's involved in the decisions around that versus one who's not. And we see the same, family finances, major home purchases, that if you're working, then you're more likely to say that you're involved in making those decisions. Like I mentioned, we did ask women about their own self-assessment of well-being. And here we were looking at a difference between women who take their children to daycare and those who do not take their children to daycare. And we begin with maybe losing confidence. And the question was, have you felt that you've lost confidence? And in the last, I believe it's month, often sometimes, rarely or never, many of them will say they've not lost confidence. But you do see some differences between those who are using daycare and those who are not. But of course, we haven't had the time to dig in because it has been more about ensuring that our intervention is going on correctly. So we actually haven't had time to assess these data and look at them critically. But I just wanted to highlight some of our findings. We decided to try out the use of the country ladder, of course, being aware that it might not always work. And part of our the reason that we want to try this is we are only asking this question in the second wave of data collection, is that we've used a similar ladder, which is about which we've been using to assess people's own subjective assessments of their socioeconomic status relative to other people in the community, and that seems to have worked. So we were interested in trying out whether this might work, and unfortunately I cannot tell you whether it works or not until next time this year. So assume that this ladder is a way of picturing your life. The top of the ladder represents the best possible life for you, and the bottom rung of the ladder represents the worst possible life for you. Indicate where on the ladder you feel right now, and they just point to it. It hasn't taken 8 minutes, because otherwise that would have been, we would have been alerted in terms of that. So all they do is they point, and we're collecting our data using tablets, and so we'll be able to tell you in about a year whether it works or not. But like I mentioned, I think for me, the value of the qualitative data is really putting the women's voice actually in explaining whether they feel empowered or some of the challenges that they face. And I think in some of these pictures, you see this element of choice. If I had a choice, this is what I would do. Or if women had a choice, this is what would have happened. So these were some of the pictures taken, and the captions that are there are from the women themselves. They actually sit down and agree on, is this the appropriate caption, and they put it up. So the mother went to look for a casual job. If she was able, she would have had someone take care of them. They would not be eating and playing with mud, which can cause diseases, which is that whole issue. You need to go to look for work. It's important. You have to survive. But you also have children. What do you do? And in this case, you leave them outside and you go and look for work. So in other words, they lack choice. And the same. So you get it, because men are bad these days. You can get someone who takes and harms one of these children. If this mother was able, she would have been taken the child to tuition or daycare to stay there. So again, if women had a choice, if they had perhaps access to financial resources, she would have used daycare, but instead she's left them out. And just to add that GrOW has actually been listed as one of the most dangerous places in Nairobi. So it's a real risk in terms of it's a balance between leaving my child at risk, knowing that they're in danger, and being able to work. And then this is another way that many women will manage daycare and work, is that you leave the child with an older child who, in this case, has even forgotten that he was left in charge of the child and taking care of the baby. And it's risky because it's by the road, lots of cars, and we do know in these particular settings that risk of death from road traffic accidents is quite high. So for me, I think that the qualitative aspects and reach some of what that we see or might not see from the quantitative data. But in the end, I still wanted to reiterate, I think with questionnaires, we also need to be cognizant of the person who's on the other side of the interview and how much time we can actually demand of them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's so interesting. I took a lot of notes for the future book. I really like that last story. I have a similar story in Cali, Colombia, where it made me think a lot about choice too, and about whether sometimes going to work is not really empowerment. So it's more like a philosophical criticism. I was following all the focus groups, and we did something really interesting, that it was to do small focus groups of 3 people and to 3 women and go to their houses so that we could have a more intimate conversation. In focus groups, sometimes there's leadership, personalities that influence other people, so we took that decision. And I remember a story of a woman that when we started talking about decisions over work, how do you take a decision, how do you negotiate with your husband, and so on and so forth, she started crying. And she told us her story, and she was suffering from domestic violence. Her husband was beating her up, and she was very empowered and denouncing him to the police. In Colombia, they started working that now. And she left, and before leaving, she had 3 teenagers. And her husband, in the informal sector in Colombia, it's very hard to impose someone to pay child support, because there's no income to take from any money. So she had to go back to work after she divorced her husband, and she lived in one of the most dangerous places in Cali. I'm from Cali, actually. It's a favela called Siloé. And 2 out of her 3 kids were killed in gangs. So she was crying and crying and crying. She said, I should have let him beat me up because my children would be alive if I didn't have to go out to work. Teenagers need a lot of supervision. That's something important that also influenced my model in the quantitative aspect, because, for example, I was controlling for women that had children before the age of 6, which is when mandatory schooling starts. And I'm like, no, I have to control until they are like 18 because when you're little, well, primary school can be very costly or daycare is very low quality. Then if they're in primary school or secondary school, they only go to school 4 hours per day. And then when they're teenagers, they're on high risk of getting recruited or killed by gangs. So it never ends up. So that influenced my model, and in addition, it made me think about what Caroline was saying, like, did she have a choice? Her choice was either getting beaten up or worked or supervising her kids but not having money to eat. So that's, I think, a very important reflection when we're thinking about empowerment as going out to work, because sometimes it's not, it's very complex. So just to continue, I wanted to tell this story, but the next round is what can we do? How can we improve these methods? How can we, for example, develop more specific questions? As I said before, I don't have many responses to it. I have been thinking about it in the case of Colombia. So I'm going to speak a little bit about Colombia and Peru, and then we go again, and we have some proposals, and we also would like to hear, after we finish, from all of you, if you have similar experiences, if you have any advice for how can we measure women's empowerment more accurately, taking into account all these issues that we are talking about. And I'm thinking about also having an open session tomorrow if anybody is interested in discussing about this issue. It will be very helpful for the book. So in terms of, I need the presentation. In terms of Colombia, I really like what Rachel was doing, because that was one of the ideas we had, but we didn't follow up with the subjective dimensions on the data gathering. But I think that one of the solutions that we are proposing is that we go to specific details, and specific is to be very concrete and specific about the questions that we're asking. So, for example, and give case scenarios also. So, for example, if we're talking about choice and autonomy, don't ask about choice and autonomy because it's a very abstract context. So if you could choose whether to buy a fridge or not, could you make that decision? I'm just thinking of that, but very similar to what Rachel was proposing, to be very specific with questions, to first to know whether they can make a decision about that specific item, and second, to make it applicable to their daily lives. That's one of the questions. For me, the ladder, I call it the stairs, but the ladder in Colombia, I wouldn't use it. It didn't work. I don't know if it would work if we use the same ladder with each specific case. Maybe that's an option that we could try. About decision-making models, I would invite, I don't know if you have found these kind of situations, but I would invite, when we have the opportunity to do mixed methods, we can compare the decision making, and we can also and be critical about it. Maybe in some cases it works, like it seems that it's working in Kenya, but in others it doesn't. So I think it's very important to be critical and to compare the results from the mixed method, because it can give us an information whether we have to follow up through some specific cases where we found contradiction, because it's also what we saw in the case of Bangladesh. I think that in some cases behavioral economics and lab experiments can really help to get some information about decision making, like in the case I did for Colombia, and if you're interested I can forward you the paper. I think that sometimes we can only see how people would behave in certain scenarios when we have this kind of lab experiments, and then something bigger. I couldn't offer jobs to people, so it's not really the whole truth, but we can see how people would behave in certain scenarios. So I think that when we have the opportunity in some key issues, for example, this of decision making that is coming through so many times, it will be interesting to do some lab experiments about it. And subjective well-being, something that I discussed in a think piece that I wrote already about is that we need to go also to things that are, can I show something from the presentation that was at the end? We need to really understand what is important from women from the field. And as researchers, and I did this mistake, try to not to impose our own views. This was the last case that I didn't present, but it's in response of what happened with the subjective well-being part that I explained to you. So for example, I said, okay, this quantitative part didn't work, so let's do something qualitative. Researcher that is behavioral economics from Camilo Cárdenas from Universidad de los Andes helped me out to think this activity. And it was a participatory democratic activity, which what I did was I was with them because it was the same thing that I told you about. So I asked them, okay, so let's reconstruct what is important to them. Let's go back to the basics. So because they are not understanding these subjective questions. So what is a woman that I admire? This is the first square. What is a woman that I don't admire, the kind of woman that I don't admire? What is the life that I would like to have? And it was very subjective, so we explained what was in that case life. And what is the life that I know, and how this is how I would achieve it. So it was very interesting, and I have some analysis with Atlas T in qualitative. And for example, it was interesting because they would admire a woman that was, let's see if we can see in the next one, that have values. No, this is not admire. Let me see, violentas. A woman that I don't admire, that is not very spiritual, that doesn't, that has a bad mood, that is lonely, that doesn't have values, that is a bad daughter, that is violent, that doesn't take care of her home. This is taking into account that these women take care of their home and the children 10 hours per day, so they don't admire if a woman doesn't do that. They wouldn't admire me. Bad mother and domestic violence. So that's an example. And a woman to admire is someone that is educated, that has violence, that has values, that takes care of home, that is a good mom, that is a fighter, that is a worker, a hard worker, but that wasn't very common. So then we said, what is the life I would like? To have a good health, to have work or a business, to have economic stability, to have justice. Family was very, very, very important, one of the most important ones, and the community. Materiales is like material things, resources. And then we went, how do we get that kind of life that we want? And something very important that I didn't mention there is when we talk about living poverty and improving their lives, something that came out with the concrete is that instead of saying, oh, I want to leave the neighborhood or I want to improve my life, like a subjective concept, they would say, I want new tiles for my bathroom. Very concrete. I want to improve I want a new floor for my house. Sometimes the floor is just earth. So very, very specific things they were saying. Like we put them together, but I want my children to finish high school. So this helped us. We didn't continue through with these, but what I learned from these, like if I had to, because I'm a quantitative person, so I would like to create better questions and variables to measure these on a quantitative. I would put options that are not, living in poverty, improving your life, but improving your house, improving your roof, not even the house, improving your roof. A lot of people have water coming in because the roof is not good, so improving the roof, having tiles on the floor, that is a proxy for wealth in Colombia, actually, the material of your floor. or your restroom, and so on and so forth. So that is an example of how concrete questions that they gave us when we were asking, what is the kind of life you want? Oh, I want out from my bathroom. So that shows how we can ask something subjective and explain it, and they're going to give very concrete answers. So that is one of the things that we propose doing in these kind of scenarios with qualitative. So conclusion, decision making, I will be skeptical, but it works in some cases. Just compare between methods. Behavioral economics helps to understand what is going on. Experiments, I love them. And then get really, really specific, concrete questions in some scenarios instead of asking subjective questions.
So I really want to get on to hear what people in the audience think. So I have various things I want to say, but I'm going to maybe hold off.
Thank you. I think that the discussion was very interesting. I particularly like the approach that you were taking in two dimensions. One, I think that it's very valuable to include experiments in the survey, so you can learn how to frame the questions and how framing these questions differently give different measures of empowerment. I like very much the approach that Rachel was doing on her experiments on the questions. And I think that also these type of choice experiments in which participants actually have to take decisions on or hypothetical decisions on certain dimensions could be very useful to understand empowerment. I appreciate very much the approach that you were taking in your research on including the local context and understanding how the local cultural factors affect the way that people will be answering. And I think that it is very valuable because we as researchers sometimes tend to ignore the local cultural rules and start asking questions that people could not understand. But then the problem that I see is comparability and aggregation. So if we start going into an environment in which we go so much into the local context and we adapt our vignettes and case studies and reinterpret the questions according to the local norms, can we then compare it across different cultural different countries and different setups? And there I would be much more concerned on whether that is a good practice or not. And second is just regarding in general the external validity or the experimental demand effects that we are creating also in survey questions. Why is people so often telling us stories about their own life? Because they want us to reinterpret whether that is good or bad. And they are just asking for a clue on what shall I answer? I don't know what you want to hear. And I think that in surveys, although experiments are the ones who are criticized for using experimental demand effects, I think that is even worse in surveys. And I don't have a good suggestion on how that can be addressed.
Thank you very much. I'm fascinated by the session. I have tons of reactions. I will try to select 2 or 3 that I want to share with you. I'm also very sympathetic with the point of, let me frame it in this way. We just saw that there are important differences in terms of what we get from the field, from surveys when we ask individuals with their partners, and when we ask groups. So there are differences in what people say. It's probably interesting to complement what people say with what people do. And what's the way to look for it? With experiments. Experiments is a very nice way to look for what people do. In experiments, it's well established also that framing matters, as it does in surveys. When we try to get specific, as it was actually highlighted in the session more than once, we are getting into particular frames, and the particular frames will induce different answers. So the heterogeneity in terms of what we are going to get in the field will increase, and the different measures will get different, and we should start to learn how to deal with that, how to live with it. The world is heterogeneous, and we should think about ways of bundling these different measures. And let me just get a little bit complicated on this, because what we want here is not only good measures of empowerment. Empowerment is not an end, it's a mean. So what we also want to look at is different ways of measure relationships between empowerment and other measures of objective and subjective well-being. So these relationships also matter. I have many things, but one last thing I would like to say is, it seems to me there is this implicit assumption that empowerment or power is always good. And let me emphasize something that I said yesterday. Empowerment is not a free lunch. It comes with responsibilities. It comes with time, with a time bill, and it is not always something that we should take for granted that is desirable. Exploring that is also probably something interesting for the field.
I sometimes worry that those of us who work on sort of more subjective aspects of women's empowerment are very hard on ourselves. We sort of assume that the other data, which is supposedly hard, is actually hard without any measurement error. Let me give you two examples. One is that the fertility history, we seem to think that fertility, nobody can make a mistake in collection. We have collected fertility history for same women for 2 rounds, and we find considerable mismatch. And we're actually now trying to figure out why there is a mismatch, and it seems to be largely children who have died and girls who have moved out. So now we are trying to actually look at its impact on fertility rate, mortality rate estimates, and sex ratios at birth. So the measurement actually sometimes has a reason why there is a measurement error, and studying that measurement error could be a very worthwhile thing to do. The second thing is that almost in all of this discussion, we are focused on mistakes that we as researchers make in framing the questions. But there is a whole lot of errors that come through the enumeration process, and sometimes the concepts that are hard to get at. So for example, today we say that India is the hotspot of child marriage. You go through the NFHS data and you find that 50% of the women said they married before age 18, and yet you look at census data and less than 15% of the girls are married. So clearly there is a mismatch in the data on current status versus the retrospective data on marital history, and I actually know why all those errors are happening, and I happen to believe the census rather than that history. But 50% versus 15% is a huge error. I think at some level we as social scientists have to accept that there will be errors. There are reasons why there are errors, and we do our best to minimize it rather than throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And I think it's people who work on gender are particularly hard on themselves, because this is a group that comes, it's a cross-disciplinary group of sociologists, economists, anthropologists, whereas other areas are often single discipline and hence not necessarily as critical of themselves.
Rachel, I saw you have a physical reaction to some of the comments, so I'll start with you since you're already there.
Can I just be... people are using experiments in lots of different ways, so I just want to distinguish the different things we're saying. I completely agree that experiments in surveys, i.e., it would be great to have more people ask the same question 2 different ways, and then we can start building up a database of whether there's a systematic difference in how people are asking. And I don't know whether we know which one is better, but at least get a sense of the measurement error in a sense. Then there's experiments, doing a behavioral experiment as an outcome measure, so the kind of things that you were talking about. I would advocate, yes, that's sometimes useful, I would advocate, what I was talking about I don't call an experiment, like actually giving someone a choice and seeing what they do. It's not an experiment in a lab, it's like prompting an actual behavior, observing an actual behavior. I like those a lot. I mean, you can also see it with, purchasing things, giving people vouchers. I think that those are a lot very useful. I wanted to talk about social desirability bias. I think that's a huge issue in this area of gender, and we have to think about it a lot. And so my main way I think we deal with that is pushing the question to be more specific. Because then if you ask, what did you do yesterday, as opposed to what do you generally think, people tend to just think about what they did yesterday and they don't worry about what you're going to say. I do think that there is this trade-off, though, that as we get very culturally appropriate and asking the questions that are very relevant in this context, which is what I tend to do, it is then hard to compare that across studies. Mainly, I'm trying to look at the difference between treatment and control, what I'm most worried about. So I tend to go more towards something that makes sense in this context, because then I can see whether there's any difference between treatment and control, but then mapping that back to an indicator that other people can compare with is really hard. And then if you want to say, well, if you're going to try and do a meta-analysis, you can't, which project had most effect on, which intervention had most effect. Well, if everyone's using a different measure, that's a problem. So I think I tend to try and include some things that are generally accepted, but also lots of things that are locally, very grounded in the local context. And as I say, for empowerment, I feel that especially because it's about what women want to do, and what they want to do may be different depending on the context.
I actually want to add one thing, like the observation. When you did the qualitative part of it, the whole team, including me, we were actually observing the girls, how they are talking to us, how many times we have to rephrase, what were their expressions, and how they are taking our questions. So it's not only me, but the whole team were there, and so we ranked. Actually, the ranking, I'm not sure whether it is scientific, but we ranked those girls in a way whether these girls seem to be empowered to us. And the way she talked, we found many of the girls, they talked, really without any, probably they are not having any intervention, but the way they talked, and I'm sure when the girls are going to grow in and, living their lives and proceeding to the future, they seem to be the empowered girls, the way they talked. The thing is, whether they will get through their pathway, if we see that the empowerment is a pathway or a process, if they get some of the barriers being solved, then they will go the way we are expecting. But if it is not, they will be stuck, but somehow they will find their way. And there are some girls we also found that they are not that much esteemed by themselves. So they will just sit and they will wait for their turn. So these girls, I don't see them as empowered as we are expecting, but if you push them from behind, that might work. So these are the observations we had along with our team. So when we did work, even though we have to make them contextual, we also have to see how they are working, because we actually spend sometimes nearly 2 hours or something, having a chatting or something. It's not like we are having a questionnaire and filling it up. It's like, chatting and, laughing and talking to them, and sometimes we are being interrupted by the child, by their in-laws, so we have to wait. The thing is, you have to consider why I am talking about context, because of the child marriage issue, and it's already been told that it's multi-sectoral, and we also have to consider the whole context of it, the in-laws, the community, the barriers which they are going through, and then you have to find out, even though they are having so many constituents, how they are behaving. So these things we have to, I think we have to consider when we observe the qualitative sessions, and that is most important for the researchers, how they see those girls. So these are observation tools we have to consider. It's not only about only the guiding questions we are using.
I think just sitting here, I've been reflecting and trying to wonder, what does it mean when we say that a measurement doesn't work? Because I was just wondering, I was just reflecting back on the slide about the distance, like where can you go by yourself and where can you not go by yourself? And yes, if we were to say on average, is it within a certain perimeter, on average, more women can go, or girls, versus outside? And of course, there'll be those nuances that if it's a school, it doesn't matter where it is, you have the freedom to go. So does that question really not work? Just asking in terms of how far can you go from here, on average? And then it was the same about the healthcare decision making. So many people say it's a joint decision, and when you look at the breakdown, in terms of immediate care, more women can make that decision on their own. But in terms of making the purchases, it seems then the husbands and others come into play. So when they do say, on average, that it's a joint decision, then maybe it's true that yes, if there's an immediate if I need to go for an emergency, yes, I can make that decision, but when it comes to purchasing, perhaps I don't have the financial income, and so I have to involve my husband. And I think I've also seen that in Burkina Faso, where it was a study being done by a PhD student, and yes, many women can make that decision to go to the clinic, they can get the care, but once it comes to the time for payment, then they have to approach their husband. So is it a single decision or is it a joint decision? And maybe they're right, it's a joint decision.
I think I would like to comment on that. For example, when I assume that something doesn't work, it's because we use these kind of, in my case, I was using decision making questions as a proxy of empowerment. So when they say that I take the decision over work, I assume that is empowerment, and then I realize that they are not really free to decide whether they work or not. So in my case, that is why I say it's telling me something different, and by making it more concrete, like Rachel suggests, we get more information. But if we take it as a whole and we are using it as a proxy of empowerment, we can be not we can be making an error, right? So that is in the case of Colombia. In the case of experiments, I didn't have time to show this, but to show an example, what Hugo was saying is that, for example, we say, okay, you have the freedom to choose whether you work or not, and they say, who makes the decision? We make it jointly. So behavioral experiments allow us to take it according to the context, and this is an example, which is what Hugo was suggesting. And we try to make it, although this is a lab experiment, as real as possible. So we took daily wages of informal and the formal sector in Cali, not even at the level of Colombia, but in Cali, that is the third city. And we take, if you see, for example, we take hours worked, because that has an impact on whether I will work or not, and the age of the children. So the time of transportation, this is very important, because in big urban areas it can take you 2 hours to go back and forth to the urban area of the city where you have to work. And whether the job is informal or informal, formal gives you access to pension and health, but informal gives you flexibility and access to childcare, and whether they trust or not the childcare. So this is an example. It's a little complicated experiment, and I'm not going to go into details, but talking about making decisions maybe is too general to ask whether I take the decision by myself or jointly. What the experiment shows us is it depends. It depends particularly when there are children. It depends whether they trust or not the childcare. It depends on the number of hours worked and whether the job is informal and informal. So giving these kind of situations and contexts allow us to understand something. For example, for me, something very important from this experiment, in addition to the fact that they don't really make decisions jointly always, is that we can develop all the policies we want. If we don't give childcare of quality, many women are not going to go out to work, or they're going to prefer having entrepreneurships at home. So this is something really important that came out from this experiment. It gives us also more information about what policies can be developed. And talking about policies and responding to Marcela's comment, I think that if we get so contextual, we're going to lose comparability, but I think that we also have to ask why we are doing that. I used to work at UNDP in New York, and I was looking at a regional level, so my interest was comparing countries. So that would be awful for someone that compares countries. But now in Colombia, and being so close to the government, I am more worried that my research helps the government, helps Colombian women to get access to the labor market, to have more income. So as a Colombian researcher that is so close to the field and to the government, that's my interest. So I think that as researchers, we also have to think what we want while we are doing research. And in my case, and I think in the case of a lot of people that are doing research in the country, is to improve knowledge so that policies can improve. In that case, I think that context and local knowledge is more important than comparability across countries.
Started a few minutes later in this panel, so if I can just, I know there are some questions left. Okay, now we have many more questions left. We won't get to all of them, that's just a fact, but I wanted to get to people who raised their hand before, and I think this is a good prompt to say why it actually matters to have an open session discussion about this, keep the conversation rolling. But if you can just
Thank you so much. I have about two issues. One, first of all, I appreciate the information you are giving about the methodology. But I'm so happy that it's like a general understanding and kind of consensus that it's important to have several methods. And I think with economic empowerment, you have to do that. I just wanted to refer to an example of accessing healthcare that you gave. When you ask a woman on when you fall sick, who can get this medicine for you? I'm just thinking about in our context in sub-Saharan Africa, specifically Uganda. When this mother is an educated mother, I will be able to say, I need a Panadol. So can you get for me a Panadol from a drug shop? Now, if the mother is not educated or learned, it's not knowing that I need a Panadol or a paracetamol, but I need to consult probably a medical person. Now, I'm a sick mother, but I'm also an uneducated mother, and then I don't have anyone to send. Now, what am I going to say in the response? I'm going to say no. But it is the context. This is my understanding. But at the same time, if you ask, do you have anyone to send? We have issues with sending young girls in long distances. She might get a problem along the way. Now, if all my children are girls, I'm just going to say no, I have no one to help me. Just because I don't have a boy, I can send. You see, I mean, the responses can be based on what is available. And I wanted to use an example in our study for her case about asking the women on the relationship they had with their husbands. Most of the mothers that we got, we wanted to get households that had married women with children under 5. Man says, yes, I'm married. And then actually went through other methods to realize she's not married, she's a single mother, she had a one kind of stop relationship, but in that society you're not supposed to say, I'm not married when you're a woman.
One of you just want to tackle this, and then we'll close the panel. Unfortunately, I think we need to kind of give you a chance to regain the will to live through coffee, but I think we'll follow this up in an open session in more depth.